Good evening, and welcome back. Before we turn the page on this epic tale, hit that subscribe button. Join the Vellum Stories library so you never miss the next ancient secret we unroll. Tonight, we journey into the depths of one of the world's oldest and richest mythological traditions, Chinese mythology. These myths are filled with tales of creation and chaos, of gods and dragons, of immortals, emperors, and the spirits who watch over the living. We will meet heroes who tamed the great floods and pioneered the invention of writing, gods who ruled the heavens, and cunning figures who traveled between worlds. These stories have been interwoven for millennia, shaping not only China's past, but also its very perspective on the cosmos. As always, I wonder where you are spending this moment with me. What time is it? Perhaps you are lying down in bed with a dim light, or perhaps you are simply trying to create a quiet moment for yourself. I hope this narrative brings you a measure of peace and tranquility tonight. This story is as old as the first dawn, a legend etched into memory over thousands of years. Tonight, it belongs entirely to you. In the beginning, there was no sky, no earth, and no sun or moon to measure the flow of time. There was only limitless darkness, disorganized shadows, and the shapeless fusion of a light yet to be born. It was a boundless dimension where there was no direction and no sound, where the concepts of time and space had no meaning, a pure, unbroken chaos, a heavy and constant stagnation that lasted for ages. Yet in the midst of this stillness, something began to stir. The ancient storytellers imagined it as the nascent world hidden in a deep sleep inside an egg. That shell contained all forms of stone and water, breath and flame intertwined, stirring in a restless dream. This egg floated in the void for 18,000 years, holding within it countless possibilities. Then, without warning, the shell suddenly cracked. The first whisper of wind was heard from the fissure. A glow spread, and an immense presence, lying beyond all secrets, made itself felt. With the first groan, all silence ended. From the depths of the darkness, Pangu was born, the first and mightiest of the giants. He was so immense that his head brushed against the arch that would become the sky, while his feet were already planted in the deep. The axe he held in his hands was a mighty weapon forged from the very essence of chaos, and with the blow he swung, he split the egg in two. This action sounded like a booming lightning strike that echoed through the empty heavens. The purer and lighter part of the egg rose to form the sky. The denser and heavier part sank to become the earth. But these young, unstable entities were drawn back to each other, threatening to crush the void between them. Upon this, Pangu stood firm on the ground and, pushing the heavens up with his shoulders, used the full strength of his colossal body to keep them apart. The long waiting began. The sky ascended 3 meters each day, and the earth thickened at the same pace. Pangu, adapting to these changes, grew, lengthened, and deepened his strength. He struggled with his whole being to prevent the sky from collapsing and the earth from catching up to it. The seasons sped by, yet there was no sun or moon to measure them. Only the changes in the air's coolness and warmth announced this cycle. Mountains rose beneath his feet, and stars danced with a faint shimmer above his head. Pangu observed the silent, awe-filled labor of the giants. For an unbroken 18,000 years he bore this heavy burden. His breath turned into the winds that swept the young world, his voice into the distant thunder, and his sweat into the rain that nourished the soil. In the nascent world, Pangu's strength became a pillar, the foundation for all future life. Even though mortal eyes could not yet witness these moments, his very mission would remain an immortal memory in the mountains and the endless dome of the sky. Finally, with the sky standing high and firm and the earth broadened and strengthened, Pangu's inexhaustible power began to wane. That figure, the sole protector of existence and a wall between the realms, had completed his task. Yet the weight of finishing his duty crashed upon him like a mountain, consuming his last energy. The wind that once blew exuberantly from his lungs was now a soft whisper. His roaring voice was heard as a dull echo, and the majestic being slowly began to sink to his knees. His breathing grew lighter, and his eyes, once filled with shining stars, resembled embers about to die out. There was no one to remember or honor him. Pangu peacefully settled between the young sky he created and the fresh earth he shaped. In his final rest, the power radiating from his body became the greatest gift he bestowed upon the world. In the silence that followed, the heavens seemed to bow in quiet mourning, and the earth, taking over the heavy responsibility he bore, seemed to draw a deep breath. Following this peaceful transition, Pangu's colossal body slowly began to transform.
With his last breath, the wind that covered the ground was born. Following that breath, clouds appeared in the sky, enveloping the world. His powerful, now silent voice turned into the fierce thunder that echoed amidst the storms. His left eye shone and became the sun, and his right eye, with peaceful serenity, turned into the moon. Thus, day and night shared the sky in a never-ending balance. Stars burst from his hair and beard, covering the sky with an eternal blanket. These cold yet captivating lights became a guide for people to easily recognize the seasons. Pangu's gigantic body slowly adapted to the shape of the land, leaving one final gift to the world. The blood in his veins flowed out, spreading across the earth as rivers, adorning the planet with silver and crimson curves. His flesh turned into dark, rich, and fertile soil, preparing the ground from which the first forests would rise. His hardened bones formed the mountains and hills. These sharp peaks stretched like spears into the sky, while the marrow hidden within his bones evolved into gems and stones that one day humanity would value. What remained of his skin formed the fields and plains. His sweat mingled into the rain and dew, the source of life for humanity. Even his death was full of power, but some say the echoes of his death cry remained buried in the earth, turning into the deep rumble of earthquakes, ensuring the world would never be completely silent despite all the changes. Nothing was wasted. His teeth and nails became the precious metals hidden in the unexplored depths of the rock. The tiny insects and fleas that lived in his boundless hair spread across the earth, transforming into the animals that would roam the forests and fields. Thus, Pangu's death was not an end, but the beginning of a great creation, shaping nature itself. His body and spirit scattered to every corner of the world, allowing life not only to exist, but also to grow and flourish. There was no tomb or monument for him, for the whole world was his resting place. The mountains were his bones, the rivers his veins, and the sky was the dome he raised with his own strength.
As the Pangu era ended, the age of the world began. From that moment, the world was open to the effects of time. The seasons completed their cycle under the watch of the sun and moon, and the mountains and valleys stood firm as the foundational pillars of everything. No living creature had yet trod the earth. The winds blew freely across the desolate lands. However, the world was preparing for the first stirrings of life yet to emerge. In that silence, a truth was hidden in the new world shaped by Pangu's sacrifice. Everything would be built upon his legacy. Those yet to be born, whether aware of it or not, would inherit the power to create their own world from the gift of this ancient giant. In the silence created by his departure, the young world lay vast and empty beneath the dome of the sky that Pangu had lifted. Rivers still whispered over the bare stones, and mountains stood guard over valleys where no life had yet met. The winds roamed freely, and the rain fell without finding anything to witness. The sun and moon continued to trace their free paths in a blank and limitless sky. This was a land of silence, without laughter or lament, a place where beauty was softened by the weight of its solitude. For all its glory of mountains and plains, something was still missing. What good was a world if there were no beings to walk upon it, to know it, and to collect memories? And so, the Mother Goddess came to these silent lands, a weaver of unspun destinies with her gentle hands. She was not born from chaos like Pangu, but seemed to have always wandered at the edges of creation. Now she was stepping into a place that needed her touch. Nüwa walked across the four corners of the world. Her eyes wandered over the curves of the rivers, the sharp lines of the mountain slopes, and the still lakes that mirrored the sky. She was dealing with a world only half made. For all its glory of mountains and plains, she felt an unquenchable silence waiting to break through. The smallest fragment of time flowed across the land, and a quick shiver of immortality wove with something else. The silence and loneliness were shifting as a new age began.
She saw beauty,
but it was the beauty of an unfinished work. Although everything seemed vast, there was no music upon the land, no birds singing in the trees, no humming of insects in the meadows. This profound emptiness pierced her like a sorrow, and she decided to fill the world with beings who could look upon it, love it, and give it voice. She knelt by the bank of a warm river and scooped up yellow clay from the shallow waters, feeling its cool moisture, weight, and elasticity as she turned it in her hand. Slowly, with delicate care, she shaped her first creation, resembling her own form, a figure that could stand, with eyes that could see, a mouth that could speak, and hands that could work. Then she breathed life into it. The figure blinked awake in the light of a world that had been in darkness until that moment. The small, uncertain sound of its first breath was the first echo to break the world's silence. The goddess gently placed the figure down, then began to walk on the new ground with bare feet, and the path of the story was drawn over human footprints. She continued to create new beings with satisfaction. Each was different, some tall, some short, some quick to smile, some more serious and reserved. She endowed each of them with the power to think, to remember, and to imagine. However, this creation process was slow, and while Nüwa's patience was endless, she knew it would take centuries to fill the vast expanse of the world. So she tried another method. She fashioned a rope, dipped its end into the clay, and then swung it quickly, scattering droplets of clay onto the ground. Wherever a droplet fell, a human being sprang to life. Some were shaped from the finest, smoothest clay. They were the ones who found comfort. Others were formed from rougher, coarser clay. They were the ones who struggled through labor and strife. Thus, the world went from empty to teeming in a single day. People walked from the hills to the plains, talking and singing. Their voices now formed the first chorus of mortal life. Nüwa watched the scene from a distance with quiet pride. Her heart warmed as she saw families finding each other, fires being lit against the nights, and laughter echoing in the wind. The world was finally alive. For a time, everything was in its right place. People lived under the open sky, drank from the rivers, gathered fruits and grains, and built their first shelters from branches and mud. They held deep respect for Nüwa, but they had not yet settled on a name for her, for she had bestowed upon them both life and a land to live upon. Nüwa walked among them unnoticed, her presence felt in the gentle breeze of summer or the sudden silence before a storm. However, these peaceful days would not last long. A heated debate arose among the gods in the great halls of the sky, growing into a blaze that fueled the fire of war. The legends vary. Some say it was the proud and rebellious water god, Gong Gong, who defied the will of heaven and sought to rule all realms. Others claim it was merely a conflict of honor between Gong Gong and the fire god, Zhuolu. Whatever the cause, the ensuing struggle erupted into a chaos that shook both the sky and the earth. In the end, Gong Gong acted on the fury born of defeat and turned his wrath upon Mount Buzhou, one of the 4 great pillars supporting the dome of the sky. With a mighty, furious blow, he cracked and shattered the mountain. Thus, the life's work Pangu had dedicated to order slowly began to unravel. The celestial dome was torn open, and from that gaping fissure, flames burst forth, streaking across the sky like burning forests, then scorching the plains to ash. In the midst of this anarchy, rivers swelled and overflowed, pouring through the cracks, drowning villages and fields. Mountains bowed, their peaks shifted from their foundations. The path of the sun and moon wavered precariously, and the stars pulsed with a trembling light. The earth groaned under the weight of the chaos, and humans, caught unprepared and defenseless, scrambled to seek refuge on the highest ground they could find to survive.
Meanwhile, monsters, driven mad by the grip of flood and fire, roamed the valleys, and the air was choked with ash and dense steam. The world had seemingly reverted to the primordial disorder from which it had been born. Seeing the great peril into which her children had fallen, Nüwa felt a sorrow as deep as the seas, and a resolve as strong as the unshakable mountains. She instantly rallied, for no other power on earth could mend this broken order. Nüwa journeyed to the furthest corners of the world, gathering the 5 sacred stones, red, yellow, blue, white, and black, each embodying the essence of a different element. She melted these stones in a great furnace. The colors merged, forming a glowing river of molten light. Nüwa carried this dazzling mixture in her hands, transporting it to the fissure in the sky, and covered the wound with a patch that shone like a rainbow after a storm. The heavens still trembled. The remnants of the overturned pillar were pulverized. Nüwa sought out the great cosmic tortoise, and after slaying it, she set its 4 massive legs at the 4 corners of the earth as new pillars. Thus she made the sky firm once more. However, her task was not yet complete. The flood still roared, ravaging the valleys, and the fires raged relentlessly. Nüwa built dams of reed ash along the water's edge and soothed the flames' fury with her voice until they subsided. She drove the wild creatures that came with the chaos deep into the forests and high mountains. Only when the land returned to silence could Nüwa finally rest. Her weary body was heavy, her garments were worn and scorched, her hands were covered in calluses and burns. It was then that the people began to emerge from their hidden caves and hills. Their eyes looked up in wonder at the sky, which was now adorned with the soft colors of the stones Nüwa had melted. And the world was saved, not by the wrath of the gods or the might of superior armies, but by the quiet sacrifice of one who loved it so much that she would not be laid low.
Nüwa sought neither tribute for her great deed, nor had a throne built for herself. She asked no worship from the people. She simply continued on her journey, leaving behind only a sky painted with color. Even after she left, the people would never forget the presence of the one who had patched the broken void and mothered the world every time they looked up at the sky above them. The Imperfect World and the Gift of Fuxi. When the wounds in the sky healed and the pillars were set in place, the young world was still a fragile structure. The floods receded into calm rivers, and the fires that licked the mountains were drawn back into the depths of the earth. Meanwhile, the people shaped by Nüwa's hands began to build their homes by the streams and at the foot of the hills. They sowed new seeds, gathered wild fruits, and raised their children in this land marked by the catastrophe. The waters had pulled back and the air was cleansed, yet the world's crust still bore the scars of the great disaster. These marks were everywhere. The world was no longer a flat surface. The plains were tilted and the seas penetrated deeper into the lands. The sky, although restored to its former integrity, now hung at a slight incline. The sun no longer rose and set exactly where it once did. Each day it shifted slowly toward the west, dragging the stars along with it. Though the people did not understand the reason for this change, they noticed the signs in the sky. As the seasons varied over time, the world proved that it had been irrevocably altered by the catastrophes of the ancient age. This was a truth that no one fully knew, for this was the cost of the new pillars erected in the sky. The tortoise's 4 legs were strong enough to bear the sky's weight, but they were not of equal length. Thus, the blue dome now hung at a subtle tilt. The seas began to flow with greater force toward the southeast, flooding distant lands, while the rivers accelerated, carving deep valleys into the soil. Along with the Earth's tilt and climate shifts, the cold of winter pressed harder from the north, moving further south, while the southern lands became hot and humid. These changes were not just inconvenient, they forced people to reshape their ways of life, to understand the world's renewed cycles, and to adapt to the altered waterways and sharpened winds. However, the created people met this new order not with despair, but with determination and resilience. Over time, Nüwa quietly moved among her children as an unseen guide. She instructed them not with explicit commands, but with subtly offered guidance. Rumor has it that she taught them how to weave reeds to carry grain and fruit, how to make clay pots to store water during long droughts, and how to build durable shelters that could withstand the violent assaults of storms. This knowledge became the essential skills for the people's struggle for survival. She taught them not only individual survival, but also how to live in solidarity. They learned that they had to be communities that protected one another against the dangers of the wilderness, sharing their food and labor. Nüwa did not establish a throne among them, but her presence was felt in their rules. Inspired by her teachings, the people began to develop laws that were in harmony with the balance of the world. They established an order that punished waste and greed, protected the land, and valued abundance. Yet Nüwa's burden was not light. In her own travels, she would sometimes encounter the bones of those who had succumbed to the catastrophes.
she would kneel to cover their bodies, which had been carried to distant lands with earth, whispering words only the wind could carry. She could not ignore the difficulties the changing climate imposed on the people, the harsh winters in the north resulting from the lowered sun, the sudden floods in the south caused by overflowing rivers. But the balance in the world was delicate. Any further intervention risked disrupting it irrevocably.
Therefore, Nüwa aimed to instill in her people the strength to cope with what they could not resist. According to the legends, she would sometimes appear in the guise of a weary traveler, sitting by the hearths of lonely homes, sharing knowledge on how to fish, preserve food, or predict the rainy seasons. This way, they could sustain their lives by learning from the world's cycles. In the heat of summer, they could read the stars and feel the coming of rain, at times signaled by the sky. She never lingered. When she departed, she would leave a small gift waiting for the family. Sometimes a basket of fruits from a garden that did not grow nearby, or a pitcher of cool, fresh water, even in the midst of a drought. With these quiet, heartfelt gestures, her love touched her children, not like a ruler binding his people, but like a mother generously and thoughtlessly caring for her family. Her most lasting legacy was not in the skills she taught or the tools she gave, but in the knowledge that the world could be reshaped when needed. People remembered the moment the sky was torn open and the seas rose, yet they never forgot that the world was repaired not by the decree of a council of gods, but by hands kneaded with love. Over time, this story was passed down to new generations. Parents told their children, and they in turn told theirs. With each retelling, the truth of what had been done became more deeply rooted. Neither earth nor sky was immutable. The labor of a few could preserve the lives of the many, and love, coupled with determination, was seen to withstand the fury of destruction. As the first generations spread across the land and their descendants multiplied, the scars in the sky blended into the blue of the day and the silver of the night. But in the cycle of the seasons, the bed of the rivers and the tilt of the horizon, her influence was still felt. The world she saved was not flawless, but it was alive, and it would endure as long as those who walked upon it remembered the time it was pulled back from the brink of disaster.
Thus, Nüwa silently faded into the legends. Her name echoed in the breath of storytellers, and her memory was etched into the minds of the people she had reshaped with her touch. She never sought to be worshipped, but in time she would be remembered with prayers and small offerings. For in the hearts of mortals, the understanding sprouted that, without her, the world would also cease to exist. In the years when the sky was repaired and the waters found their boundaries again, the people shaped from river clay lived like any other animals. They had voices, hands, and minds, but they had not yet learned how to use these abilities. Therefore, at the first sign of cold rain, they wandered from place to place in small groups. They slept in hollows like foxes. They tried to feed themselves with whatever they could strip from bushes, gather from branches, and tear from bones. When hunger confronted them in its harshest form, They fought for roots and to seize the eggs of shorebirds. In this struggle, there was no law separating bravery from cruelty, only the temporary victory of the strong and the deepening despair of the weak. In the evenings, when the mist rose from the river mouths, their fires would quickly die out, for none knew how to keep the flame alive through the night. It was a world full of daylight, but devoid of wisdom. It was a season of beginnings where unseen paths had not yet opened. It was into this chaos that a man named Fuxi came. He was remembered not for his silent steps or his shining eyes, but for the resolute patience with which he placed his hand upon the savage nature of humanity, pushing it toward order like a farmer stubbornly plowing a furrow in a difficult field. And how he achieved this,
the storytellers still speak with a tone of reverence and solemn gratitude. For the responsibility of teaching is quiet. It is neither celebrated by the drums of war nor proclaimed loudly. Yet these victories live on even beyond the tombs of kings. They say his gaze held the calmness of deep waters and the sharpness of an observer examining the shoreline. Meanwhile, the reeds bowed before the wind. As he walked among the people, he moved not like a conqueror, but like a simple observer. He listened, he watched, and he learned where pain was felt most deeply, or where fear made people harshest and most cruel. Based on this knowledge, he acted with compassion, starting with the smallest mercy. For he taught them how to keep the fire alive in a piece of charcoal at dawn, and how to nourish the smallest spark to strengthen the moment it lasted. Then he explained that meat did not need to be torn raw from the bone. It could be placed upon stones heated by fire, thus softening its fibers and providing strength, not illness. People who applied this knowledge and fed themselves this way felt a miraculous renewal. The fevers caused by parasites slowly subsided, and the pains in their bellies decreased. Because of this small change, people began to realize something. The days were growing longer, for they were not spending every hour in a killer hunt for the next bite. The nights became more tolerable, for the fire repelled the cold and the threats of darkness. Once their stomachs were full, he turned to the creativity of their hands. For he saw people wasting time searching for fish in the streams, with only mud and broken pride left from their efforts.
Then he took vines and fibers. Patiently he wove something with patterns resembling the braids of the reeds along the shores. He cast this woven net into the water, and soon it was full of writhing silver bodies. People finally saw how a simple act of thought could multiply in effect. They called this acquired knowledge a blessing, for abundance was no longer solely dependent on a hunter's speed, but could be increased through patience and planned action. This knowledge and skill, rising from the riverbanks, reached the farmlands, where he taught the people to observe the seasons instead of desperately hunting and scavenging to get through a day, to read the weather from the clouds, and to bury seeds at the right time, allowing them to emerge from the darkness. And so the land responded with bounty. Greenery grew that did more than satisfy a single meal. To enable them to do this well, he taught them to fashion wooden handles and cutting tools from stone. First, he made tools that could work and break the soil. He told the people to move beyond merely chasing animals and to herd and keep them together. Soon, instead of goats that ignored human existence or dogs that followed their footsteps, there were animals that gave fresh milk in the morning and loyal dogs that slept on the doorsteps and provided security. Thanks to this simple harmony, milk flowed abundantly, the animals were protected, and winter-resistant hides were prepared. He did not conceal the years of failures and famine. He taught people to keep count, to set aside grain when the harvest was fruitful, and to ask for mercy from the sky when it was poor. At the same time, he taught them to humbly learn from both lucky and unfortunate moments. As people gathered in more stable settlements, he realized that hunger was no longer the only threat among them. For when people lived close to one another, fear and desire turned into anger. Therefore, Fuxi pondered how to buy not only reeds and nets, but also the restless heart of humankind. He did this by giving names to the bonds that spread like mist and gained meaning. He defined marriage as a rope willingly knotted between two people.
He described kinship as branches on a single trunk. He forbade acts such as taking a woman by force or stealing a neighbor's provisions in the hunger of the night. He imposed punishments on those who opposed him, punishments that stemmed not from cruelty, but from cold wisdom. For he had seen that no growth was possible in a village where people did not trust one another. Once, the people who gathered only due to the conflict of hunger now gathered around a common fire. At that fire, Fuxi taught them not to forget the day's work and to link the tasks for the next day with a net of promises. He also taught them songs so that children could quickly learn and show commitment to these promises. He taught them to bury their dead with care so that grief would not turn into the fear of dark places. Furthermore, he taught them to lift their eyes at dawn and offer the first smoke of the cooking fire to the sublime powers. Because he knew that people who only thought of themselves could quickly turn into beasts again. But those who preserved the value within them would hold the plow firmer and manage their anger longer in the council. In time, nomadic families were replaced by clans. Councils where conflicts were resolved were established. People who were once scattered like leaves in a flood now measured distances by driving stakes into the ground, seeing them not as dangers to be crossed, but as fields to be maintained and roads to be walked by friends bringing news or salt. However, order never came without resistance. There were those who scorned the bonds of marriage, those who raided storerooms by moonlight, and those who laughed at the thought that an oath could be stronger than a spear. Fuxi responded to these people not with violence, but with a justice that returned slowly but surely. Cruelty
was a wall that pushed back the sea. He set compensation as the first rule and exile as the last. In places where blood was shed, he was not satisfied with grief alone. He demanded more. He wanted them to take responsibility for the wound inflicted on the fabric of the clan and the village. He washed his staff of dust and stood silently in the marketplace. He continued to speak until his anger subsided and until the people shared the belief that their children's tomorrow, next year, and the next winter would drink water from the same well.
The fear that fell upon his followers gradually evolved into a different kind of discipline. This discipline arose from knowing one's place and responsibility, and the confidence that the laws would be applied fairly to everyone, whether friend or foe. Under such an understanding of justice, the first feelings of compassion in society began to sprout like moss growing in the shade. The notes of the zither echoed at twilight. Stories were exchanged for a bowl of millet. A carved horn figure left on a stone by the riverbank was there simply because the carver loved to see it. When he returned collecting the netfish, the land had been persuaded to give back more than it had received. Homes had learned to line up like saplings. Fuxi set his gaze beyond this, and with the harvest, conflicts ceased. He looked at the river for a long time, until its surface calmed and reflected back not just his own face, but a pattern lying behind the faces and names. In that moment, he understood that if the sounds of fire, water, mountains, and thunder could speak, it would be a much simpler, more ancient language. A language that carried a narrative more primitive, yet more powerful than what he had taught. This was the language he decided to transmit to his people, with symbols they could carry in their minds and trace onto wood by lamplight. For this effort was the beginning of a completely different narrative. For now, suffice it to say, under his hands the savagery of the people softened without being broken, and their bellies were filled without becoming hardened. Their courage turned from cruelty to protectiveness. Their days became orderly, like stones lined up by a stream for a traveler to cross safely. When the hunger of the people were suppressed, the anger of the villages was tempered with compromise. The fields responded to their seeds with abundant harvests, and the stones in the marketplace were warmed by the hum of familiar voices at sunset. Fuxi's gaze shifted from the hearth and the furrow, for the greater question that gave him no peace was upon his mind, the question that had puzzled him ever since the first net drew silver brightness from the river. He knew that the labors of a lifetime could be ruined by a sudden winter or an abruptly overflowing river, and he understood that a people who did not learn to read the great face of the world were no different from a rower with his back turned to the sea. Thus, he aimed not only to train hands, but also to develop eyes and minds. He brought to the people the grammar of a language with which they could read the earth and the sky like a shepherd reads his calloused hands. He went alone to the calm curves of the Yellow River. There, the banks were exposed like bare ribs, and the current murmured to itself. And he waited there, between the dawns that carried the scent of wet clay and the nights that held the cold glow of distant fires. One morning came, and the mist had settled on the water like breath on a mirror. That morning, the water gently stirred, and a creature that was neither a horse nor a dragon, yet bore the grace of both, rose from the water. The scales on its back were patterned with dark and light, like a lattice written upon the river. The creature did not speak a single word. It merely floated past. But in Fuxi's mind, it left a pattern as clear as footprints in fresh mud. At that moment, the chief grasped a truth. The world does not scream the truth. It organizes it. With empty hands and a mind open to everything, he returned to his people, and he began to scratch thin lines onto the texture of tree bark and smooth bones, shapes representing yes and no, submission and determination, dark and light, the simple yet meaningful music of those two enormous currents that lay beneath every fight, every fall into love, and every storm. Then, from those lines, he created triplets, so that one day 8 figures appeared before his council. They looked like 8 ancient elders, guides whose advice was never contradictory. These figures were named not with fancy adjectives, but by their function: sky and earth, thunder and wind, water and fire, mountain and lake. In this way, even a child at the doorstep could understand that this was not merely symbolic magic, but the building blocks that wove the order of the world. With these signs, he taught them to cast the stocks and read the count of changes. He showed them not how to depend on luck, but how to question how to respond to the phenomenon approaching on the horizon. As time passed, that small area became a center for inquiry, a place where divers and farmers came to learn patience. It was also where counselors tasted the sting of certainty and preferred to choose prudence. Ofa instead. Warriors were reminded here the truth that even the hardest blow is doomed to fail when it resists the flow of time. And when the villagers had to decide between clearing a forest clearing or extending their fields toward the river, the elders' duty was not merely to impose their own views. They sat with the trigrams and listened to the silent wisdom of the seasons. Many disasters were prevented by offering people a chance to think beyond their anger. Other skills were drawn from the same pattern well. For once a mind learns to understand a hidden truth, it becomes inclined to shape it. And so Fuxi began to weave new paths from the old scratches and notches that hunters made when counting days and birds. And they turned them into signs that could carry a name to places unreachable by voice. Humanity learned that memory could be preserved on wood and bone, that a message could travel farther than footsteps, that a word carved on a tablet was more durable than anger, and that a written song could be sung again by someone who never knew its singer. The first script, crude as it was and changing and evolving over time, served as a bridge built between the living and those yet to be born. The clans that crossed this bridge became distinct from those who could not, for they gained the ability to preserve a lineage not just through blood ties, but through ties of thought. And they realized that an order based only on rules could quickly turn into a cage. In the evening, they placed an instrument on their knees, and from its strings rose a sound as clear and clean as cold water. This was neither a warning cry nor a lullaby to soothe a weeping child. This was the first consciously produced music, a creation in itself. The notes drifted through the darkness like lanterns, returning softly.
People soon discovered that the patterns that guide the seed and shape the storm could also guide their hands and breath. And thus were born rhythms for planting, melodies for mourning, chants to gather the people, and light, gliding tones that lifted the day's weight from shoulders. With the tranquility brought by music, a deeper courage developed, the ability to be patient with unpleasant answers, and a loyalty to a winter that promised nothing but demanded everything. They did not keep these arts merely as ornaments to be stored in private areas. They shared them like water. They taught the youngest among them to draw trigrams on the edge of game boards, so that the game could teach them life lessons that sermons could not offer. They taught the most sagely determined of the elders to keep records, so that the law would not become a shifting wind when the chief's mood changed. And they asked the sharpest eyes to observe beyond the clouds and the movements of birds, so that the calendar would be the servant of the fields, but not the tyrant of the homes. But every gift carried a shadow as great as its light. Every pattern held warnings that could tempt the proud to confuse their fate with destiny. Therefore, they reminded their divers. The lines only showed the direction of the veins, but the hands decide how to carve the wood. They told their scribes that words had a binding power, but warned them against the danger of blindly clinging to the meaning people assigned to them. They reminded their musicians that melody was only a guest, and it grew weary in an environment that was too ostentatious. Thus, he protected the village from the problems that reason could bring. Moreover, he succeeded without feeling the burden of contempt, because he knew that wounds caused by arrogance could be repaired more effectively with laughter and focus on work than with moralistic lessons. In the final years of his life, with the trigrams having become a focal point in every home, and the first stitched plates accumulating in baskets woven from reed bark, Fuxi sat once again on the bank of the Yellow River. There he listened to the diversity of the tongues flowing along the river, the roar as it rushed over the rocks, the whispers in the shallows, and the silence where it expanded and moved like a colossal beast. He was resting. In that moment, he grasped that his term as the guiding hand was over. The people now needed other gifts. Gifts not of examples or signs, but gifts of the earth, of the leaves, and of the fire forged by suffering. Teaching these new gifts would be passed on to another, one who carried a different passion within him. He stood up silently, proceeding without any ceremonial display. He walked back to the village through the fields that were once covered with wild thickets, and the streets where children chased each other across doorsteps. He passed under the doorframes carved with the simplest of characters. The people watched his passage with a love reserved for those whose names would still be whispered in the night long after their bones had become one with the earth. When he finally disappeared from sight, the river still spoke, and the wind continued to touch the reeds. The 8 wise figures waited patiently on the diver's mat for the next question to come, as they would wait for thousands more. This people, who did not yet even know their own identity, had learned to stand tall beneath the heavens, never forgetting that the sky had laws that everyone, including kings, must obey. Shennong, the divine farmer. When Fuxi's long and silent reign ended, the world passed into the hands of a ruler whose nature was different, but whose purpose was equally great. The ancient stories speak of the divine farmer, Shennong, the one who carried the strength of an ox on his shoulders and the patience of the earth in his heart. Fuxi had tamed the savagery of the people and laid the foundation for social order. But Shennong turned his attention to the earth, for he realized that the people were still left to the accidental mercy of nature. A bad season could bring famine instead of law. When the hard and cold months came, the memory of a generous harvest gained in the past neither alleviated the hunger nor warmed the hearts. Shennong understood that a society dependent on the uncertain fate of the hunt or the fickle moods of the forest could never build a lasting world.
His mission was to teach the people to see the earth not just as a ground upon which their lives were shaped, but as a partner in their survival. He started with the most basic truth. The land, when correctly guided, could provide far more resources than the forests or the rivers. He traveled the fields and valleys, studying the structure of the terrain, the direction of the wind, and the flow of streams that overflowed with rain and shrank in the summer. He fashioned the first plows from curved branches, hardening them with fire and equipping them with pointed stones attached with ropes. Using his hands, he taught the people how to press these pools into the soil, turning the earth upside down to reveal the fertility hidden beneath the surface. Under his guidance, they sowed millet, barley, and rice,
Thus, they learned that scattering grain should be done in regular rows that the earth could feed equally, instead of random handfuls. Shennong's work was not a knowledge quickly gained or a gift bestowed. It was a discipline that filled the hands with water and strained the shoulders, a patient labor learned over time. He taught the people to clear stones from the furrows, to pull weeds without hindering the growth of young plants, to observe the sky to anticipate the arrival of rain, and to track the sun's effect on the soil to maintain productive efficiency. He showed them how to terrace the soil on the hills to prevent erosion, and how to dig canals in the valleys to carry water to the fields during drought. As the seasons changed, the labored fields responded with gold and green. For the first time, there was a period when people stocked enough provisions to last through winter. Hunger was not yet completely gone, for every land brought its own trials, but the land no longer seized control or dictated the lives of the people as it once did. With food security came stability, and from stability emerged trade. Shennong gathered the scattered clans to places where paths intersected and rivers merged, laying the foundations for the first markets. People brought goods such as grain, meat, tools, and cloth to exchange here, but under his leadership, these gatherings became more than just commerce.
These markets became the heart of the young society. Songs were passed along with baskets. News spread with jars of millet wine. And the people, who were no longer just scattered villages, gained a sense of being part of a whole. Shennong also presented them with a calendar of 24 solar terms, reflecting the movements of the sun and the transitions of the seasons. Farmers could prepare their fields for planting before the rainy season began, and harvest their crops before the cold returned. The earth was still a vibrant, untamed, and unpredictable force, but with the knowledge he offered, people were no longer beggars before the soil, but partners working in harmony with it. By the end of the first decades of his reign, Shennong's labor had left its marks on the land. Hills were shaped by layers of terraced fields. Valleys were carved with canals, and marketplaces were humming with the loud clamor of people who no longer feared the dry months. But Shennong's eyes were not fixed only on the fields full of grain or the overflowing granaries. He noticed another kind of hunger that afflicted his people, a hunger that grain could not satisfy, the hunger caused by illness, that deep lack that occurs when the human body weakens and no consumed food can restore the lost strength. In this new struggle, Shennong understood what his next great task was. The fields had protected his people from famine, but he also knew that the earth could not protect them from every danger. Diseases crept into the villages from season to season. In the summer, fever engulfed the bodies of children, leaving them too weak to rise. In the autumn, brightly colored berries and strange-looking mushrooms, tempting to hungry eyes, concealed deadly poisons within. When winter came, burning coughs tore through the lungs, making breathing difficult, while spring teemed with stinging insects capable of filling the blood with venom. Despite all this struggle, the wooden or stone tools in the hands of the villagers were helpless against invisible enemies. Shennong had taught his people to cultivate the land, but now he believed it was time to tame another enemy, disease. For this purpose, he turned to nature once more. for the earth had the power to heal, just as it nourished life.
Shennong set out alone at first, roaming the mountain ridges, riverbanks, and cool, moss-covered valleys. Carrying only a small knife, Shennong patiently began to examine the untouched wild vegetation. He worked tirelessly, like a patient man who would even plant a tree from whose shade he would never benefit. He examined, boiled, chewed, crushed, or tasted the sap of every new plant he encountered. Some plants left clean and sharp tastes, easing the pains in his body, while others burned his tongue, darkened his lips, or spread through his veins like fire. Among the people, whispers spread that Shennong's body was different from an ordinary person's, and that his belly was made of crystal. They claimed that this allowed the essences of the plants to find their way through Shennong's interior, leaving a trail of healing. Whether these rumors were true or merely the imagination of storytellers is unknown, but one thing was certain: Shennong had paid the price required for every new discovery. For days he ingested roots from the shadows of the mountains, leaves sprouting in the humid forests of the south, and mushrooms growing only in the darkest valleys upon decaying tree trunks. He imprinted into his memory the colors, shapes, the type of soil each plant preferred, and the seasons when they were most effective. He began to test treatments on the sick. He gave bitter teas to those with fever, offered poultices to those whose wounds were festering, and brought the smoke of dried leaves for those who struggled to breathe with a cough. Thus, the desperate prayers were replaced by cures. Children who seemed to be wasting away in their mother's arms lived to run in the fields again. Hunters, left for dead after snake bites, returned to hunting. But every cure came with a price. One plant had cast him down with unbearable pain, either stopping his heart for a moment before making it beat again with a shaky rhythm. When he reached the heights of the western hills, he bit a stalk. That stalk sent a cold fire through his body so quickly that his legs abandoned him halfway, and he fell to the stones. According to the old stories, as his vision faded, a light breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby tea plant. A few of the leaves fell onto his lips, and in his last breath, he chewed them. The bitterness of the plant expelled the poison, bringing him back to life. Whether this story is true or not, the tea plant became a gift to the people, a beverage that could clear their minds and rest their bodies.
At the end of his long search, Shennong had learned how to use hundreds of plants. He had taught people to boil bark to unlock its healing power, to crush leaves to clean wounds, and to process roots into tonics that strengthen the blood. He turned this knowledge into a great compendium carried through the memory and words of healers. Plants were cultivated to cope with hunger, pain, insect venom, and sometimes the darkness that seized the mind. With this knowledge, healers emerged in every settlement, individuals who ventured into nature and returned with green stalks and dry flowers, transforming them into medicines that ensured a life longer than anyone had known before. The era of Shennong's reign would be remembered as a time of both nourishment and healing. The land under his protection fed the people, while the plants healed them. Shennong was neither a warlord nor a palace king. His power came from his continuous and steady work.
The people remembered the seasons before him, spent in fear of famine, and the times when they were certain that illness would find them sooner or later. By his side, they learned, when approached with knowledge and patience, both the field and the forest could serve humanity. After Shennong's death, the tools he gave remained: the plow, the market, the calendar, and the healing leaf. Even as the seasons continued with storms and droughts, and death found its way to every living thing, the people would no longer be as helpless as before. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi. After Shennong's death, the land he nourished and healed did not fall into ruin. The plows worked the soil, the markets bustled with trade, and the healers continued to venture into the forests in search of new remedies. However, the peace he established was fragile, for the valleys were filled with many clans, and the bonds connecting them were weak. Each possessed its own unique traditions and system of chieftainship and an honorable past. But the lack of a common authority to bind them all together fueled the competition between them.
It was in the midst of this turmoil that a leader emerged unlike any the country had witnessed before. Xuan Yuan Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor. One day, his name would be recalled as the ancestor of a nation, but initially, he was merely one of the ordinary chieftains leading the Yushang tribe in the northwestern hills. Though not outstanding in physical strength or stature, the Yellow Emperor was one of the most observant. He subtly watched the actions of the surrounding tribes and the rise and fall of their fortunes. He noticed the mistakes that weakened them. He understood that a people, even if they won a battle, would in fact lose if they wasted their strength in the wrong places. When scouts informed him that the Flame Emperor, Huangdi, was claiming rights over the fertile lands, Huangdi did not rush to confront him. Instead, he carefully assessed the situation. He organized his forces purposefully and formed alliances with the smaller clans who were weary of Huangdi's oppression. The struggle took place on Ban Quan, a plain full of low hills surrounded by rivers. The conflict lasted for days, and neither side retreated easily. Huangdi's discipline and strategic acumen finally brought victory. But instead of completely defeating and destroying Huangdi, he offered him terms. This decision was not born of mercy, but of foresight. Huangdi knew that a defeated enemy would be nothing more than a memory, but an ally could provide greater benefit. Huangdi accepted this truce, and the two leaders brought their clans together. This union strengthened them to face a greater threat: the 9 Li tribes led by the warlord Qiyu. Qiyu was known as a true element of fear, both physically and mentally. His warriors were as savage as wolves, as ruthless as storms. Legends say that Qiyu's head was like a bull's, and his body was like forged bronze. It was said that no weapon could pierce his skin, and no chain could bind him. His tribe were skilled metal workers. They produced blades and armor that surpassed the stone and bone weapons of their enemies. Qiyu and his tribe descended into the Central Plains in fire and blood.
crushing everyone in their path. Huangdi and Huangdi knew that if they acted disjointedly, Qiyu would tear their peoples apart and seize the interior regions unopposed. Upon this, they united their forces, gathered their warriors, and called upon their allies from the hills, valleys, and distant river mouths. They assembled their armies in the marshy lands of Zhuolu, a place that was like a deadly ground that completely sapped a man's energy. The decisions made here would chart their ultimate destiny.
Qiyu arrived with symbols emblazoned on the black banners of his clan, and a multitude too large to count. The opening days belonged to him, and he created a fog so dense that soldiers stumbled in their own ranks, accidentally killed by the hands of their allies. As panic spread in waves, a disintegration began in Huangdi's ranks. It was at this moment that the Yellow Emperor unveiled his greatest weapon. This weapon was neither a sword nor a bow. It was a magnetic, gear-operated war chariot that always pointed south. Guided by this unique device, the soldiers found their way through the suffocating fog, reorganized their ranks, and began to advance. Huangdi called upon his brave Yakshong tribe, who fought to the sound of horns and drums. The thunder rising from the sky echoed over the marsh, disrupting Qiyu's rhythm of attack. But Qiyu responded to this challenge with storm winds and wild rains. Huangdi had prepared for this eventuality. He prayed to Ba, the goddess of drought, who was masterful at stopping rain and drying clouds for aid. The dragon Yinglong descended from the sky. With powerful beatings of its wings, it left not a trace of the fog behind. With the fog completely lifted, the battle became fierce. Spears clashed, shields shattered, and the marsh overflowed with death, stained with blood. Qiyu fought with all his might in the center of the battle, savagely defeating everyone he encountered. But the combined efforts of Huangdi's champions were needed to vanquish him. When he was finally captured, he roared with such immense fury that the earth trembled. The Yellow Emperor, knowing that his survival could lead to new wars, ordered his execution. The victory at Zhuolu was certain, but the cost was heavy. Thousands of lives had been lost. Dead bodies remained on the Mer River for days, and the survivors worked with all their might to bury them. After this war, Huangdi became more than just a leader. He became the true architect of the nation. He established laws that united the clans, built roads that connected the most remote corners, and invited people with creative talents to his court. During his reign, new tools were invented, more durable shelters were built, and the nation took its first steps toward building a common identity.
Silk was spun in the halls of his queen, Lei Zhu, and the people acquired clothing strong enough to withstand the seasons. Throughout his decades of leadership, the Yellow Emperor governed his country through both periods of peace and times of hardship with the same determination. By the end of his life, the tribes that once fought over every hunting ground or riverbank had been united under a single banner. Legends say that he did not die like other men. He rode a dragon into the sky and vanished among the clouds. Whether this event was real or merely a dream created by later generations is unknown, but his death certainly marked the end of an era. The lands he left behind were stronger than ever. However, they would need all this strength to cope with the uncertainties of the future. Even though the wars among men had ended, there were still powers in the world that could shake even the pillars of heaven. As the Zhuolu marshes began to dry, the news of Huangdi's victory over Qiyu began to spread across the country. For the people of the Central Plains, Huangdi was not just a ruler, but a symbol of destiny. He was the one who had gathered the clans and broken the authority of the most feared warlord in history. But the task of uniting a people was not one that could be completed with a single victory. The Yellow Emperor was aware of the fragility of the peace achieved at Zhuolu. Old animosities still smoldered like banked embers. The tribes he had brought under his rule would need a reason to remain loyal after the drums of war had silenced. The lands he claimed spanned a vast area, stretching from wide river valleys to mountain ranges. But these distances could lead to obedience being forgotten over time. To hold the country together, he needed to offer the people more than just a common enemy. He needed to offer them a common purpose. He had to offer them the promise of a shared life. Therefore, Huangdi first decided to build a capital that could serve as the center of his lands. He chose a place where rivers met, where trade networks flowed, and where fertile soil could sustain armies and artisans. This center became the solid foundation upon which he would build his empire. Roads cut across the hills and valleys, connecting distant villages to the new capital. Messengers carried news, commands, and the beginnings of common legal principles to the four corners of the country. Markets flourished along the roads. Here, products from the mountains were exchanged for grain from the plains and the silks of Lei Zhu's weavers. During the peaceful years that followed the Zhuolu period, inventions rapidly advanced.
Huangdi gathered skilled individuals to his court who could work metal, decipher the language of the stars, or convert the power of wind and water into useful work. The labor of these geniuses resulted in finer bows, improved agricultural tools, and sturdier shelter designs. It is rumored that Changyi began the art of writing while in Huangdi's service. Thanks to writing, records were kept, agreements were put down, and the kingdom's memory extended beyond the limits of a single generation, spanning centuries. Music, in turn, was shaped by rhythms that celebrated planting, harvesting, and festivals. While his court busied itself with craft and administration, Huangdi never forgot the lessons of war. He reorganized his armies, establishing pure systems that prioritized discipline. He also built signal towers to ensure that news of any threat spread faster than the enemies themselves. The borders were secured, but Huangdi avoided constant warfare, preferring to forge alliances through marriages and negotiations. Thus, the stability over the country was further solidified. Years slowly turned into decades, and the reign of the Yellow Emperor became an era that marked history for those who had only known conflict. Yet, despite all his successes, Huangdi seemed to know that the world would not remain static. He understood that power could not be aimlessly held in a single hand for too long. In the last years of his reign, he slowly began to withdraw from the daily affairs of the court to teach the art of leadership to his successors. During this process, he directed his thoughts toward the legacy he would leave behind. He realized something greater than his own existence in the unity of the kingdom, the possibility of a nation unified by common law, common craft, and a common memory. When he left the world at the end of his life, it is said that he did not go to the earth like ordinary men. Some tell that a great dragon descended from the clouds and ascended Huangdi to the heavens before the eyes of the court. Others say he simply walked into the mountain mists and never returned. Regardless of how it happened, his death was seen not as an end, but as a transformation. A mortal leader becoming a figure eternally etched into the spirit of the kingdom. The banners of his clan were lowered, but the roads he built, the laws he established, and the unity he forged remained permanent. In the time of his successors, the empire shaped by Huangdi would face new problems, threats both from within and from beyond its borders. Nevertheless, his reign held a very special place in the memory of the people. It was seen as a golden age when the clans of the Central Plains united.
In Huangdi's time, the heavens were stable, but the ancient stories contained warnings that even the firmest foundations could be shaken. The gods, like men, were full of ambition. Their conflicts could also affect the lands of the world. The kingdom that followed the death of the Yellow Emperor was different from other states that often fragmented after their founders died. His order managed to remain solid. The roads he opened still carried merchants and messengers through the provinces. The laws he established were still debated in the gatherings of leaders. The memory of Zhuolu was preserved as a symbol of shared pride among the great clans. However, unity was a concept that could not be neglected. It had to be protected and renewed, or else it could begin to crack over time. In the years following Huangdi's departure from this world, old rivalries and suppressed ambitions resurfaced. In this complex period, leadership passed to his grandson, Emperor Zhuolu. Zhuolu was not a warrior like Huangdi. He did not carry the identity of a traveler or inventor like Fuxi and Shennong. His talent was different. It was the ability to see the kingdom as a network of responsibilities and powers, and to strengthen this network so that it could not be easily broken. Zhuolu inherited a rich but restless land. New villages were established in the valleys, and fields expanded toward the wildlands each year. However, in the mountains, small tribes continued to preserve their old traditions, submitting to the emperor only in word, but not always remaining loyal in practice. Rivers carried trade, but they were also the silent whispers of discontent. Zhuolu
was occupied with the task of bringing these scattered lands into a single order, and he began the process by regulating rites. Sacrifices to the spirits of heaven, earth, soil, and grain would now be offered not according to the whim of the villages, but according to a calendar set in the capital every season. Music also had to be brought to order. It needed to be fixed to scales familiar to everyone, from the high hills of the north to the wide plains of the south. These regulations might seem simple, but in Zhuan Su's view, they carried a profound meaning. A society that sang the same songs and prayed on the same days would move toward seeing itself not as 100 small nations, but as one single people. Zhuan Su also placed importance on the family structure. For generations in various clans, leadership had been inherited through the maternal line. Women held authority over alliances and family memory. But Zhuan Su believed that this structure created a basis for divisions. The order of succession had to change. Leadership had to pass from father to son, and families had to be bound under the authority of a single patriarch. This transformation was not easy because it touched the roots of the oldest traditions.
In time, this change brought greater clarity to the understanding of inheritance and allegiance. However, Zhuangshe's concern was not just the order of men. In those days, the sky and the earth were not as separate as they are today. Gods, spirits, and other beings roamed freely among people. Stories told that in the era before his reign, some beings brought wisdom or help, while others created chaos. There were tribes who mastered the arts of magic and used these abilities not to protect their communities, but to serve their own ends through fear. The Miao tribe was one of the most notorious. Rumors claimed that this tribe sent storms upon their enemies, spread plague to rival villages, and did not hesitate to challenge the laws of heaven. Zhuangshu decided that these interactions between the realms posed a danger. As long as gods and spirits roamed freely in the world of mortals, no law would be guaranteed, and no peace would be permanent. So he made a radical decision known to be irreversible. He would close the path between heaven and earth. He summoned his two great ministers, Chong and Li, and entrusted them with the task. The ancient paths between the realms, ladders reaching into the clouds, mighty trees whose roots stretched from the underworld to the sky, and secret routes known only to shamans, were either destroyed or sealed. At points where a mortal could once reach the gates of heaven, or a spirit could walk among the living, only distance and silence now reigned. This decision was not met with joy. In the court, there were those who worried about losing the wisdom offered by the immortals. Shamans who advised their tribes were suddenly deaf to the voices to which they had dedicated their lives. But Zhuangshe was resolute. In his view, the world had to be governed by the laws of men and controlled by mortals. The caprices of unpredictable beings should not be the guiding force. The sky now seemed higher and the stars more distant. Dreams became the only remaining way to access the divine, ushering in an era where even they were transient and uncertain. The gods had not vanished completely, but they had withdrawn to an inaccessible plane, far from mankind. Their grace or wrath now came not through words, but through the messages of the wind, the bounty of the harvest, and the flight of birds. Some interpreted this new situation as a loss, while others preferred to see it as a protective barrier. Humanity stood beneath the sky, for the first time more tightly bound to one another within the structures built by their own hands. Zhuangzi reigned for many years, and during this time, he succeeded in preserving peace. Tribes gave way to provinces, and provinces evolved into a realm united not only by sharing roads and markets, but also by laws and rights. Although Zhuangzi never engaged in a battle renowned as Zhuolu, his legacy was just as profound and lasting. He had redrawn the boundaries of both the world and the cosmos, defining the place of mortals and gods, each now existing in their own realm. When the paths between heaven and earth closed, the world underwent a fundamental change, and a new order was born, in which people were forced to take charge of their own governance.
The first years after this closing passed in stagnation. The lands were unusually quiet. No extraordinary lights descended from the clouds. No immortals traded grain for riddles in the markets. And the massive creatures that carried the scent of the world beyond the mountains had vanished. Yet, this silence brought an indescribable unease. People were not accustomed to being so far removed from the powers they once feared. Some felt abandoned, while others worried that the gods would return in anger. Shamans and spiritual guides, who believed they were the guardians of wisdom, realized that their voices were now ineffective. Zhuangzi understood that this void could not remain unfilled for long. If the gods were not going to bring order by walking among men, that order would have to emerge directly from the people themselves. With this thought, he mobilized his mind to transform the foundations of law and authority into a strong structure that could replace the old ladders to heaven. He developed a systematic model of governance. Each province was linked to the center through loyal governors, increasing its allegiance to the throne. These governors were chosen not only through lineage, but also based on their ability to maintain peace and collect tribute without inciting the people to rebellion. Laws that previously differed from tribe to tribe were standardized, written in simple and understandable language, and distributed across the country by messengers. These laws no longer originated from the sacred commands of divine envoys, but became the very words of the emperor himself. These words drew strength from the spirit of unity and togetherness he had inherited from his grandfather. The tribute system was regulated so that it served not only as a measure of wealth, but also as a tool that bound the provinces to the center of the country. Grain, cloth, and craft materials flowed to the capital, and in return, the emperor's protection, resources, and bounty returned to the provinces. Markets in distant regions began to receive new goods for thousands of shops, thanks to the imperial roads. This trade network fostered a system of obligation and a structure of prosperity. A farmer living in the farthest reaches of the north might never have seen the emperor, but he could feel the empire's power through the stamped grain measures, the festivals celebrated on the same dates as in the capital, and the patrols that made the colonial roads safe. But even as Zhuangzi strove to bind these lands together, he was aware that ancient traditions still held sway. The southern Miao tribes, who had once misused their spiritual power by utilizing divine currents for their own gain, were the reason the gates of heaven had been closed to them. Their divine connection was lost, and they had become a community that clung to their old rights by merely whispering the names of spirits who were now beyond hearing. The tribal leaders remained loyal to their own laws and gods, continuing to resist the emperor's sovereignty. Shu did not launch a direct war against them because he knew it would plunge the country into prolonged chaos. Instead, he sent envoys, offered gifts, and managed to win over some of their leaders through marriage alliances and commercial cooperation.
Thus, the isolation of the tribes was gradually eroded. When Xuanzhu's reign came to an end, he left behind an orderly country with strong central authority, markets connected by roads, and laws etched into the minds of the people. However, this order was too fragile to last forever. Every order in the mortal world, no matter how carefully guarded, remained vulnerable to celestial and terrestrial changes. In the periods following Shu's death, new rulers ascended the throne. One of these periods was the reign of Yao, who would be remembered for his wisdom and virtue. Yao kept his court free from extravagance, demonstrating a measured approach to governance. His judgment was sought not only in matters of law, but also in resolving disputes between clans, the fair distribution of land, and the preparation of the calendar. His rule was recalled as a golden age for the empire. However, this age was shaped by enduring great trials. The first great test came from the heavens. In the early years of Yao's reign, the balance of the sky was disrupted. Legend says that the sun was a member of 10 fiery three-legged ravens that traveled across the sky in sequence, unlike the years when only one provided light. For a long time, these ravens maintained their own cycle. One would rise while the others retreated, carrying light and heat to the world in a balanced manner, making life possible. One morning, the 10, whether from boredom, mischief, or a quarrel among themselves, gathered together. But the world was practically scorched by their combined fury. The sky was filled with bright white light. Rivers turned into cracked beds due to thirst. Forests were silently smoldering on their own, and fields shriveled and withered on their own. Animals desperately died even after seeking shelter in the shade. People were left naked in the midst of the disaster, their throats so dry from thirst that they could not even find the strength to pray. Yao did not want to ward off this suffering with empty prayers, and sent out word across the country to summon Hou Yi, a master archer known to everyone. Hou Yi, a man of high reputation, answered the emperor's call, arriving with his great bow made of mulberry wood and his white feathered arrows ready for his duty. Climbing the highest peak, Hou Yi called out to the fire-breathing ravens in the sky, pleading with them to return to their order. But the ravens did not listen and continued to spread their heat upon the world, laughing from their high thrones. Understanding that mercy was useless, Hou Yi drew his bow and released his first arrow. The arrow pierced the sky, hitting one of the ravens, which fell, leaving a trail of smoke and fire. He hunted the ravens one by one. Only the last one remained. As Ho Yi prepared to shoot the final arrow, Yao stopped him, for the world could not survive without at least one son. Listening to Yao's word, Ho Yi lowered his arrow, and the sole surviving raven fled, disciplined to find the right path.
The people managed to survive this great conflagration, but only scars remained. It took seasons for the rivers to regain their former glory, and years for the soil to regain its strength. But after the fire, other dangers emerged. Creatures driven from their burning homes roamed the plains and mountain foothills, preying on the weak. Those who served Yao hunted these giant snakes and monsters with bronze-like claws that prowled at night. But as the lands recovered from the wrath of the sun, a new and greater threat loomed over the realm. It all began with prolonged rains. Rivers overflowed, spilling into the fields, and villagers abandoned their low-lying settlements to move to higher ground in the hills. But the waters followed them. Though the seasons turned, the rain did not cease. 1 year passed, then another, yet the waters did not recede. The unceasing rains turned into a massive flood, engulfing valleys and hills. It expanded as if it had no source and no end, swallowing everything. The few survivors struggled to live on narrow high grounds, fishing from the roofs of their old houses and attempting to travel from one place to another by rafts. The order that Yao had sought to protect was now on the brink of collapse under despair. The emperor sought a solution from his wise counselors, who agreed that the deluge could only be met by a leader who could tame both the resolve of the people and the power of fate. Yao, a determined leader, chose Gun, a descendant of the royal house of Shennong. Gun believed he could hold the rivers in their natural courses and tried to control the waters by building great walls and embankments. Legends say he sought a miraculous substance called Sirong, which was said to grow on its own and be protected by a supreme god. And in some way, whether by consent or theft, he finally acquired this substance. Thanks to it, he built embankments higher than the people had ever seen. For 9 years, he forced his workers to construct these massive walls, but the waters would not submit. The rising waters strained these barriers and finally broke them, spreading across the land with immense force. Villages were quickly submerged, fields were ruined, and crops were destroyed. The people began to doubt not only Gun's methods, but also Yao's decision to entrust him with this task. The floods caused not only physical devastation, but also a deep spiritual breakdown. Hunger spread even in mountainous regions inaccessible to the floods. Seeing this failure, Yao realized that this great responsibility was a matter that exceeded his own lifespan. He carefully reflected on the matter of succession, and instead of designating his own sons as heirs to the throne, he turned to a man named Shun, who came from a humble background but was known for his honesty and justice. Shun had proven his ability in irrigation projects and in resolving disputes between provinces, possessing a unique capacity to instill a sense of loyalty in people without coercion. Shun, Yu, and the Taming of the Great Flood. Yao appointed Shun as co-ruler, placing the hope of overcoming the floods in his leadership. In the final years of his life, Yao gradually transferred the burden of rule to Shun and felt the peace of knowing his country was in safe hands. However, Yao passed away during a period when the floods were still raging, yet he never lost faith that the person he chose would complete this difficult task. Thus, as the golden age of his reign ended, the empire entered a new era, not only with a collapse, but also with the emergence of a leader who could undertake the greatest trial in its history. Shun ascended the throne in a world still partially submerged. The floods that began during Yao's time showed no sign of receding, and the people were trying to heal the wounds of the disaster. Across the country, people had retreated to the hills. Agricultural lands lay abandoned beneath temporary inland seas. Villages were scattered on high ground, clinging like mussels to rocky areas. Dangerous bridges made of wooden logs and ropes connected the small settlements. Trade was conducted with narrow boats passing over submerged houses. The people measured their days by the already familiar roar of the water flowing through the valleys. The sharp smell of mud and decaying earth filled the air, and the sky seemed crushed under the weight of rain clouds. Even the sun, which rarely appeared, looked pale and weary. Shun inherited not only the throne, but also a colossal task that even previous leaders had failed to solve. His first step was to resolve the issue of Gun. For 9 long years, Gun challenged the river's power, building ever larger embankments to control the floods. But the rivers responded to his efforts with even greater destruction. The embankments he built were neither a line of defense nor a permanent solution, because when they collapsed, they turned into traps that allowed destruction to spread much faster than before. Gun's pride was as high as the size of the embankments he had built, and he was a person who would not back down from the path he believed in, even in failure. Despite this attitude, Shun summoned him to court and listened to his defense. But the final decision was clear and unambiguous. Gun was stripped of his authority and exiled to Feather Mountain, Uyushan. According to legends, some say he perished there by the decree of heaven, his body transforming into a yellow bear before dissolving into the mists. Others say he continued to wander those lands until death silently claimed him. Whichever story is true, his downfall was as harsh and evident as his disappointments. Shun did not rush to appoint a similar person in Gun's place, realizing that the same method would bring the same destruction. Instead, he turned to a figure who had learned from Gun's mistakes, his son, Yu. A man who grew up in his father's stubbornness, but preferred to seek a new path by learning from those errors. Yu, once one of Gun's assistants, had personally observed the movement of the rivers in the flooded areas. In this process, he realized that it was impossible to forcibly stop the waters and adopted a different approach. Instead of confining and stopping the rivers, he decided to build channels and canals that would harmlessly guide them to the sea.
Where Gun tried to dominate the rivers,
Yu chose to move in harmony with them. Instead of resisting the river's rill, he sought to gently shape their flow. But the difficulty he faced was not to be underestimated. The disaster was not limited to the overflow of a single river, but stemmed from the combined force of many rivers feeding each other, overflowing erratically, and threatening almost all the land. Yu chose to start primarily with the rivers around the capital. He gathered thousands of workers to dig canals and open new paths through the hills. But unlike Gun, he was not a leader who sat in the capital and issued orders. He stood by his people. He worked in the mud, lifted stones, and showed with his own calloused hands that labor was shared not just through words, but through action. His determination and perseverance eventually became the subject of legends. It is narrated that Yu passed by the entrance of his home 3 times during his 13 years of arduous work. Although he heard the voices of his wife and children inside, he did not cross the threshold while the flood still posed a threat. He believed there was no time for rest. His work gradually expanded, forming a vast network. He traveled to the 4 corners of the country. He mapped the highlands and valleys, carefully recording where the rivers swelled in the spring and narrowed in the summer. At every step, he dug canals to divert floodwaters away from settlements. Sometimes these waters were stored in lakes, and sometimes they were directed toward new river beds that carried them to the sea. He deepened river mouths to allow the water to flow faster, and when the land was too high, he carved through stone and rock to create a path for the water flow. It was as if nature understood his purpose and was responding to Yu's effort. Stories say that Yu received help from creatures of the divine realm, a yellow dragon that dug canals with its claws, and a colossal black turtle that carried stones to reinforce the banks. Whether considered as spirits or symbols, Yu's work was so arduous and vast that it surpassed the limits of mortals. As the canals widened and the waters found new paths, the flood began to recede, and the villages that had been abandoned for years resurfaced. Thanks to the alluvial soil left by the rivers, fields that were more fertile than before emerged. People returned to sowing the black earth, and the smell of fresh harvest replaced the stench of decay. Over time, the fear that had settled over the country slowly began to dissipate. The rivers still flowed wide enough to cause flooding during the rainy season, but they were no longer a destructive force that engulfed the entire region. Nevertheless, this control process was never completely finished. There was always the possibility of storms, always the risk of floods. But the massive inland sea that had claimed the land was now a thing of the past. Shun did not claim Yu's success, but honored him openly, elevating Yu to the rank of co-ruler, just as Yao had once done. Under their joint leadership, the country not only recovered, but also developed and grew. With the rebuilt roads and the reopened markets, people returned to their lives, and festivals were organized again as in the old days. However, Shun was aware that peace becoming complacency could be as dangerous as war. Therefore, he carefully supervised the resolution of disputes between provinces, the strengthening of border defenses, and the assurance of a fair taxation system.
Furthermore, he exiled 4 wicked governors who ruled the people with greed and cruelty. He sent them to distant corners where they could harm no one.
This period of joint rule was remembered not for great conflicts, but for the planned and stable construction of a strong kingdom. Shun saw that the end of his own era was approaching. Just as Yao had done, he chose his successor not from his own family, but from among the most worthy. You, who had managed to tame the rivers and reshape the lands, was designated as the new owner of the throne. Shun's death occurred with utter quietude, without the omens or chaos that characterized the farewell processes of other rulers. The people remembered him with deep respect. He was mythologized as a ruler who did not seek fame, who led his people through difficult times, and who was wise enough to hand over the burden to worthy hands at the appropriate time. When the transfer of the throne took place, the great floods were merely a memory, but the canals and embankments inspired by those memories continued to shape the land. Shun's reign continued to be remembered as a period of balance, nurtured by tradition and embracing change, one that met the present but also considered the future. The rivers flow freely toward the sea, but the lessons of the deluge resonate in the minds of those who witnessed the rise and fall of the waters, and in the example of the man who overcame it all with silent determination. The flood was not a matter to be solved with decrees issued from a closed room. You did not inherit it that way. Instead, you accepted this situation as a personal oath, a long and arduous journey from the foothills of the mountains, where the brown rivers mingle with mud and reach the open sea. During this journey, you established an order and discipline that the kingdom had never witnessed before. You took along not flatterers, but people who could measure the terrain with clear eyes, survey the slopes with a single glance, and observe the changes at the edges of the swollen rivers. You left the capital with them and walked toward the submerged lands. Touching the terrain, you marked it with ropes and stakes to determine paths where the water could flow more easily. You met with village chiefs in narrow passes and on the routes followed by goats. You listened to the advice of grandmothers who knew where the soil collapsed after spring rains. You made notes on pieces of reed, drafts of canals to be dug, ponds to be deepened. You created a plan of salvation, a revolutionary map. There was no place for rituals or displays, only the sound of digging, the effort of carrying stones, the creaking of ropes, and the determined work of those who knew that sweat could be the hope for tomorrow's dry earth.
The first principle you set was perfectly clear. Do not violently restrain the rivers. Lead them. With this understanding, you began to clear the throats of great streams clogged with their own alluvium,
removing the barriers accumulated over years, initiating the healing of seasons that had resisted an inner wrath. You ordered the waters to be guided with rakes made of timber and leather. Teams worked with large scoops, singing to keep time. River mouths were deepened, and narrow channels were opened so that the water chose its own path as it expanded. As you advanced inland, the method changed. Valleys were converted into beds that disciplined sudden floodwaters. Flood channels were dug, and sloping banks were reinforced with stone terraces. This allowed rainwater to reach the flat plains more slowly, losing its speed. Under the warm and incessant rains of the south, lakes were connected to each other with ditches. Thus, these lakes, like friends trying to carry a heavy load together, transferred the water back and forth, and this arrangement made the re-establishment of ecological balance possible. In the north, you emerged like a force breaking through a siege with the coming of spring, teaching the people to clear the ice from the culverts before the sun turned the melting snow water into floods. The authority he possessed was not based solely on his own plans. It was rooted in the example of a leader who refused comfort while others slept on cold and wet mats. It is recounted that you passed by his own threshold 3 times in those days. There are stories that each time he rested one hand on the door frame, listened to the laughter of his child, and then turned his back, because the longing in the line of men and women waiting with shovels in their hands weighed heavily on him. But the exact truth of the details in these stories is not as certain as the importance of the truth the people chose to preserve. They knew that their leader's feet were as cracked as theirs, that the wounds on his shins came from the same sharp grasses, and that he bled in the same cold waters. When viewed through this shared destiny, communal labor turned from a necessity into a shared oath. Clans sent labor not to favor their strongest, but because they could not bear to be known as the villages that worked less than the others. Along the work lines, former enemies learned the friendship of wheelbarrows and ropes. Disputes that would have once been settled with spears ended with bargaining over who would clear the longest roads by sunset. But the flood was not just about water. Chaos created its own servants. It was said that a 9-headed serpent made its lair where stagnant pools darkened and spread foul odors. Each head contaminated a different stream. Even the fish fled, and animals died when they drank this poisonous water. This horror confronted them in a valley that had not seen a dry hearth for years. The fear of the people did not turn into a cult. On the contrary, it was transformed into a struggle. You ordered the waters to be guided with rakes made of timber and leather. Teams worked with large scoops, singing to keep time. River mouths were deepened, and narrow channels were opened so that the water chose its own path as it expanded. As you advanced inland, the method changed. Valleys were converted into beds that disciplined sudden floodwaters. Flood channels were dug, and sloping banks were reinforced with stone terraces. This allowed rainwater to reach the flat plains more slowly, losing its speed. Under the warm and incessant rains of the south, lakes were connected to each other with ditches. Thus, these lakes, like friends trying to carry a heavy load together, transferred the water back and forth, and this arrangement made the re-establishment of ecological balance possible.
When the serpent finally rose, its voice was like an army of trumpets. You met it with a knife typical of long-handled reeds, and the struggle continued relentlessly until the water ran red. Storytellers often recount this battle. Perhaps they are right, because such struggles are victories that people can measure with their heartbeats. But the true great victory occurred after this event. You mobilized the people to make the swamp unable to conceal such a terrifying thing again. He taught them to dig ditches, to plant willows where there was seepage, and to build a channel that turned the stagnation into a memory of the past rather than a prophecy. But all these efforts involved not only the hands of men, but also other mysterious powers. On some mornings in the high country, you would leave offerings at the edge of waterfalls and ask the river god to show him the direction the stones would flow. In his dream, he would see a broad-backed turtle shouldering rocks and carrying them into place. This vision gave you the idea to reinforce the banks with timber and rocks. Thus, practical wisdom emerged by giving the current a deeper direction. He examined the shape traced by the foam swirling at a turn, and then dreamed of a scaly form that nested there. He gave the teams the task of clearing the rift with short shovels, so that the river could abandon its old twists and acquire a straighter bed. Call these guides spirits or the products of a mind dedicated to the waters, the result was always the same. As the work progressed, the canals became a network that imposed gentler rules on the land. An order was established where the rivers adhered to these laws without being deprived of their freedom. In the 12th year, the works reached the boundaries. Stepping on the backbone of the rocky ridges, he used his staff to draw the borders of the lands that would be known as provinces. These boundaries were defined both by the waters that flowed through them and the hills that rose above them. In the northwest, he stood at the intersection of 3 streams and commanded them not to be controlled, but to be helped to learn patience. In the east, he observed the tide hitting the same stones and then receding, thus understanding how far the breadth of the sea extended into the depths of the land. Afterward, he completed his final canals, carving them to rapidly carry the floodwaters to a hungry throat. While managing great projects, he did not forget the small details. He promised the children in their villages, who listened to the sound of water rising every night outside their doors, a future where that sound would not be a threat, but a reliable friend that turned mill wheels and cooled summers. And he delivered on his promise. When the floods finally receded, it happened not with lavish ceremonies, but with the silence of nature. Just as an illness leaves the body through time and continuous efforts to heal, the fields too were covered with furrows one morning. The people who walked behind the oxen, whose breath steamed in the cold air, were now free from fear. This time they would sow seeds for the bounty of a new season. The land left by the water was richer and more fertile than before.
The fertile alluvium spread across the fields, bowed beneath the plow. Fish in the connected lakes swam as plentifully as the stories told at winter tables. People, rebuilding their villages after fires or floods, now built them not with old mistakes, but with the guidance of the new order shaped in their minds. Homes now shifted toward the flowing waterbeds, and squares in the villages were dedicated every spring to the work of clearing culverts. Shun, who governed his people by sharing authority and responsibility, watched the calming of the waters with an unexaggerated yet profound satisfaction. He summoned his engineers to the capital. He offered thanks and expressed his gratitude at the altars. Then he did something that had a deeper impact. He wrote down what they had learned. Through his envoys, he sent copies of the texts throughout the country and commanded the governors to erect stones containing information at the start and end points of the canals. Written on these stones, which would guide generations yet to be born, were the measurements and methods for new excavations to be undertaken years later. When this event occurred, he placed you in a supreme position and declared you co-ruler in the presence of the assembled leaders. Thus, everyone could see the undisputed order of the heavens. The final touch of this situation also belonged to you, but the name this contribution would bear in the modern era had not yet been reached. Over time, you developed a system of thought based on water basins instead of clans and lineages instead of territories. You drew the borders not with the distance a spear could reach, but with the direction of the rainfall. This new order instilled the habit of acting with shared responsibilities in the designated regions. Later, when a famine struck one region, the granaries in another region were opened because the same irrigation canals had taught the people a sense of belonging. As Shun's breath failed and his eyes closed, the realm he ruled had transformed from a raft bound together for security into a vessel with a backbone. He passed away from life silently, not accompanied by thunderbolts. Rites remained in place, drums were beaten, and the people mourned a man who could restore life to a motionless world. At the beginning of a new era, you took over the symbols of governance with the same high seriousness as accepting a shovel. Although the flood had ended, the task of making the rescue permanent was only just beginning. You were guided not by the intoxication of victory, but by the determination of someone who knew that the success against the flood was only the start of a longer and greater journey. The waters had receded, but their traces were still alive in memories. Villages were now built on high ground, and granaries were moved to reliable platforms. Every spring, before the rains began, people continued their old habit of clearing the canals of mud and reeds. You had seen that the lands you governed were now connected not only by old roads and markets, but also by the deep bonds forged by communal labor.
This order was the result of understanding that the land could be shaped by multiple human hands toward a single goal. You were determined to turn this hard-won unity into the foundation of a system that would endure not only in your time, but for generations to come. Your primary goal was to reshape the structure of the kingdom. In the pre-flood era, the lands were divided along the lines of blood ties and tribes. Each clan considered its neighbors only when war or trade compelled it, guarding its own territory. But when the flood came, you realized the fragility of such an order. The overflowing rivers disregarded tribal boundaries, and one group's refusal to help sealed the fate of others. Therefore, you redefined the country's borders, not according to old claims, but according to the flow of water and the structure of the terrain. You established 9 great provinces, each named after the characteristics of its soil, rivers, or mountains. This plan was more than just an aesthetic map. It was an administrative approach rooted in nature, dedicated to understanding and serving the lands and people holistically. In every province, you based the appointment of officials not on loyalty, but on skill and justice. You tasked them to maintain the canal system, resolving irrigation disputes among farmers, and collecting taxes without tyranny. Even taxation was an element that had to be carefully measured. You knew well that in years of plenty, a portion of the harvest could be reserved for the capital, but in times of scarcity, the same demand could trigger rebellion. Reports could not show everything. Therefore, you frequently visited the provinces to see how the soil felt under the plow, the fullness of the market stalls, and to hear the people talk about governors they felt were not working hard enough. Your presence there was not limited to ceremony. You traveled the roads in simple clothes, spoke to everyone, young and old, and evaluated your success by what you saw in their eyes. During these journeys, you began to collect the people's stories and traditions and preserve them as part of the kingdom's identity. You realized that unity passed not only through roads, laws, and taxes, but also through a shared fabric of local identities that everyone could embrace. In the festivals of the South, you watched the dances that accompanied the stories of dragon kings. In the northern hills, you listened to the songs of the first hunters who chased deer in the mountains. And in the central plains, you paused in market squares where plays recounting the story of the Great Flood were performed. You encouraged the sharing of these stories because you discovered that these narratives connected people to their past, just as the canals connected rivers to their beds. The harmony you sought did not come easily. It was full of trials. Even after the flood, there were those who pursued their own interests within the new order.
In some border regions, banditry resurfaced. In the distant corners of the West, a coalition of discontented chiefs refused to pay taxes, claiming their ancestral rights had been taken away. You did not rush into war.
You sent envoys to clearly state the expectations and the gains in return. But when diplomacy was answered with fierce raids, you took action. Instead of overwhelming them with massive armies, you used swift units that moved like rivers. You attacked the enemy's weak points, cut off their supplies, and forced them to choose between surrender and starvation. In the end, most chose to abandon resistance and submit. As those who surrendered returned to their lands under the same laws as the others, your reign became known for a rare balance between determination and moderation. You possessed the authority of someone who had saved the country, but instead of frequently using this authority, you primarily sought to persuade the people. Your justice was certain and balanced. It neither bent with favoritism nor stiffened with oppressive severity. When disputes arose between provinces, you personally investigated the matter, listening to both sides before making a decision that would not shadow your impartiality. Over time, the idea that you were not just someone who calmed the deluge, but a ruler who defined the land as the boundary of his sovereignty became firmly established. However, despite the fertile fields and overflowing markets, you never forgot that fortune could turn. You strengthened the storage systems you initiated after the flood disaster and had large granaries built in every region. Thus, in periods of drought or excessive rainfall, needs could be met without the lands drying up and the people facing hunger. You encouraged afforestation on slopes threatened by erosion and took measures to protect the sources of the great rivers from overconsumption. For you, governing well meant more than solving disasters. It also encompassed eliminating the conditions that gave rise to disaster. Years later, you would better understand this vision when walking along the banks of the old canals you had opened, which were now covered with moss. In the brown waters that once overflowed the rivers, fishermen cast their nets peacefully. In the areas where the waters had calmed, children played joyfully in fields that were once 10 feet underwater. You were aware that you would remain in the shadow of legends like Yao and Shun who preceded you, but you also knew that what you had built was more than a story. This was not just regulated riverbeds, but a system that meant a living bond between people and nature. What you hoped for was not the memory of the flood, but precisely this. The final years of Yu's governance were shaped by the silence of a society settled into the stable rhythm of order, not of idleness. The flood was controlled, the regions were defined, and the laws were tested to be applicable. But you knew that stagnation could harm if left unchecked. The canals had to be under constant surveillance. A system was essential where the administrators you appointed were accountable, and the bonds between the provinces were kept alive by meanings beyond tribute or formal orders. You continued your travels. You were no longer someone rushing in the face of disasters, but a guard carefully examining the vast garden before him. At every stop, you reviewed the condition of the rivers, tasted the grain in the markets, and sought information about the governors from the elders.
The final legacy of Yu, the founding of a dynasty. He had absolutely no tolerance for the arrogant attitudes of his officers. Many officials were removed from their posts and sent back to labor in the fields they had neglected. But he governed not only with discipline, but also with foresight. He knew that the order he established should not rely solely on the memory of the past deluge, for memories fade and are forgotten over time.
Therefore, he chose to build a strong structure, a system framed by the rivers, establishing a living connection between the people and the land. A culture of shared responsibility and pride was developed between the provinces, and the exchange of artisans, farmers, and scholars across regions began to be supported. A potter from the east might be found teaching his craft in the highlands, while a farmer from the north could learn new methods of rice cultivation in the south. These exchanges bound the provinces together not just with laws, but with human ties. Thus, a connection was formed where one saw the labor of familiar neighbors, not strangers, when looking at the goods in the market. In governance, Yu's legacy was not limited to dividing the lands into 9 provinces, but also succeeded in balancing central authority with local knowledge. While the throne set the general laws, each province was free to maintain its own traditions and festivals. This did not disrupt the kingdom's harmony, but rather reinforced the sense of a vast mosaic. The empire was formed not of a uniform stone block, but of unique parts that together constituted a greater whole. While goods from every corner of the country were displayed in the capital's great market, the small fairs in distant villages were equally fascinating. It was possible to mingle with the people there and discover their daily lives, far from the eyes of the lords. However, the peace that was built could not remain untested. Following a harsh winter in the distant northeast, hungry nomadic tribes targeted the border villages. The response to this problem was not swift annihilation. Grain and salt were sent, and living space was offered within the 9 provinces on the condition that they settle and engage in agriculture. The tribes who accepted this offer contributed to the growing diversity of the realm. Those who refused and continued their raids were met with a firm but calculated force. Their camps were dispersed and their livestock taken as compensation. Yu made it a principle to first extend the hand of conciliation, yet he did not hesitate to clench his fist when necessary. Over time, the people began to remember him not only as the savior who calmed the floods, but also as the founder of a new dynasty. The decision regarding the transfer of governance was crucial. Instead of choosing his heir from among the most worthy, as previous rulers had done, he chose to recognize his own son's talents and prepare him for the throne. Although there was hesitation in this decision, given the belief that the authority of heaven rests upon virtue rather than lineage, his son's leadership abilities paved the way for the kingdom to be passed from father to son. This step symbolized the beginning of the era of hereditary rule in Chinese history. In the final period of his life, as his strength began to decline, Yu withdrew from his long inspection tours and spent more time in the capital. Yet he did not neglect walking the riverbanks and visiting the granaries during harvest time. His death occurred peacefully. He passed away as serenely as he lived, leaving behind a peaceful empire. The 9 provinces were bound together by the rivers settled into their beds, the laws he wrote, and the sense of unity that flourished during his reign. The people mourned for him not with fear for what was to come, but with gratitude for the past. In the villages, the elders told their children about the years the flood swallowed the lands, and the man who made history with the retreat of the waters. In the provinces, the governors gave instructions to clear the canals and check the embankments in his name, because this was a priority that formed the foundation of all other work. In the capital,
His funeral was held in a tomb like a low hill, beneath a mound that seemed as though the earth itself was preparing to embrace him. Your name would be etched into history, not as the conqueror of men, but as the conqueror of chaos. You would be remembered as a ruler who shaped the foundations of the land and gave his people the ability to claim it. Your reign ended the era of Yao and Shun and opened a new age in the history of the Middle Kingdom. This period was a time when the throne would pass from father to son, when the rivers would continue to flow in their accustomed routes, and when the deluge would be remembered only as an inspiration for order. From those first times to the present day, from that beginning when chaos was born of the union of shadow and light, to this very day, it has come through eras when heaven and earth separated and rulers governed with pure virtue. From the threads of raw traditions and tribal ties, the strong fabrics of law were woven. The story of Chinese mythology survived by bridging the gap between legend and history. In the most ancient times, gods and mortals walked the same lands. Their words echoed in the same halls. Disputes were resolved with a single bloodline. An epic stretching from Pangu's carving and shaping of the void to Nüwa's creative efforts, sometimes with arduous battles against demons, sometimes with supreme emperors establishing order in the seasons. This epic grew even larger. Each era added new colors and textures to the colossal tapestry. The cycle passed through a turbulent age where the Yellow Emperor Huangdi built unity through wars, yet order was not fully secured. Then to Zhuangzi, who closed the path between heaven and earth for men to shape their own destinies. Then to Shun, who measured the value of humanity amidst the rising waters. And finally to you, who dedicated his life to taming those waters. These figures were not just figures on painted scrolls. They were true heroes who carried the burden of the entire world on their shoulders. The decisions made shaped the lives of countless people. Victories and failures over time formed the skeleton of this realm. Legends mingled with history at a certain point, but there was never a stone monument that precisely defined their boundary. The gods moved away, the voices of the spirits were muted, and rulers began to be chosen according to the blood in their veins, not old prophecies. Yet the teachings of the past were never completely erased. They always remained there, deeply rooted. The rivers still follow the valleys you defined. The mountains continue to carry the temples of the first gods, and people continue to tell the stories of the ancient times when the sky touched the earth. Every subsequent dynasty would rely on these ancient roots to legitimize its own rule, and would speak of the authority of the sky as a torch filtering down from Pangu's first light and passed on from generation to generation. And thus the world born of chaos found its own rhythm. Provinces plowed their fields, markets overflowed with the riches of distant lands, and the capital was shaped as a city rising from both stone walls and the depths of memory. Those who ascended the throne after you would go to war, build palaces and monuments belonging to their dynasties, and transform these works into legacies that challenged the turning of the ages. But in a corner of the halls of every dynasty, there would certainly be a depiction, a drawing or carving of the floods and the great man who fought them.
because that was the era when the floods were tamed. The Middle Kingdom had solved the truth inherent in all myths. The effort to establish order never ends. Every generation inherits both the gifts and the burdens of those who came before it. And they grasped that the greatest power lay neither in the sword nor in the throne. The real power lay in patiently, wisely shaping the world to ensure its continuity. This story always ends where it begins, not in the sky or in unknown depths, but here, upon the living earth, right in the midst of humanity's daily life. The rivers continue to flow in their paths. The earth offers its bounty. And by the light of the fire, the same old stories are told again. The moon that shines above us still gleams under the names of Pangu, Nüwa, Huangdi, and Yu. With these narratives, the gods walk the earth once more. Emperors rule again, and the country is recreated countless times in an endless story.